I have some history with Prince of Persia. I originally played the game when I was about 5 years old. I don't remember exactly when it was, but I used to play it a lot with my brother and my cousin and her father, my uncle. We used to play it so many times, and we used to have so much difficulty finishing the game because it was a difficult game back then for a 5-year-old. It was also a violent game. For the standards of the time, it was violent, but nowadays, not so much. I would say that it did scare me a lot when I played it originally, but it was so much fun. And that's why I'm here today. I just want to give my own opinion about what the Lost Crown seems to be. And I'm gonna be honest, I still haven't played it. I just watched the gameplay preview, and I have to say, it is not convincing me. And that's the objective of this here video. I want to talk about how and what makes a Prince of Persia, and how the Lost Crown doesn't actually look like it's going to be a Prince of Persia game. It may be about the Prince of Persia, it may have the Prince of Persia, but it is not a Prince of Persia game. So join me as I explore previous entries in the series and talk about what makes a Prince of Persia and how the Lost Crown is not a Prince of Persia. Leave a like if you do, comment and subscribe if you think that this is good content, and if not, I'm sorry, I might try to do better in the future. Enjoy! Prince of Persia was originally released in 1989 to the Apple II. According to reports, the Apple II had trouble running the game. Not long after, it was released to the DOS, where I originally played it. Let's take a look at what makes the Prince of Persia games so special. First of all, it was the fact that it was a cinematic platformer. In case you don't know what that means, it means that movement is very deliberate. You have to be very careful when choosing your speed. If you run too quickly, you may die as quickly. Walking is optional, but it's always a good idea to do that. And that deliberate platforming creates a sense of danger the entire time, which is a good thing, because there are so many traps in this game. Among those are the spikes, which are very deadly. Touch them in the wrong way and you are dead. If you run at them, you die. If you fall on them, you die. If you jump over them in the incorrect position, you die. You may walk through them, but that's also dangerous if you decide to start running in the wrong moment. Another thing that makes this deliberate platforming dangerous is the fall damage. If you fall from a certain height, you will take some damage, but if you fall from a larger height, you will die. Something else that is a problem for the player are the loose tiles. Some tiles may fall from under you, dropping you to your death. Some tiles may fall on you, causing damage, and if you have only one life point, you will die. The next real challenge in Prince of Persia is the combat. It is a simple affair. You attack and you parry. There are a variety of guards for you to face. Some guards are more aggressive, some guards are more defensive, and one guard, the fat guard, is the one that shines. In my humble opinion, the fat guard is the real challenge of the entire game. Not even Jafar is that hard or that skilled in parrying and attacking. You see, when you parry, you may connect an attack immediately, and the fat guard is the only one that can do this over and over again until you make a mistake, or he rarely makes one. As far as the atmosphere is concerned, in Prince of Persia, darkness is the rule. You start the game in the dungeon, and you must climb your way to the tallest tower. The atmosphere is created by the amount of colors chosen to be on screen. In the dungeon, there are very few colors. Everything is dark and gray. As you climb up, new colors come around. Even the guards become more colorful. But you are soon taken back into the darkness of the dungeon, and you must make your way back through the palace, creating a sense of claustrophobia sometimes, a sense of abandonment, a sense of loneliness that creates a dreadful sense of danger the entire time. The most important and most distinct characteristic of Prince of Persia is the use of time at something very stressful. You have exactly 60 minutes from the very first gaming screen until you finish the game. And if you fail to do so in 60 minutes, the game is over. Another important gameplay element and story element is the shadow. After a certain level, you encounter a mirror. Once you go through it, your reflection, or your shadow, some people say your soul, detaches from the prince and runs in the opposite direction. This shadow is essential to the gameplay, and you will face it several times, but not fight it until a certain point. And that is what makes a Prince of Persia game. Deliberate platforming, deadly traps, deadly combat, the time pressure, and the presence of the shadow. Released in 1993, Prince of Persia 2: The Shadow and the Flame did not attain the same type of success as its predecessor, but nonetheless, it was an amazing game. I didn't actually play this one a lot when I was younger when it came out, but I did play it all the way through for this. And I have to say, the deliberate platforming is back. The traps are back. But the most egregious thing about this game, a negative in my opinion, are the labyrinthian maps. First of all, this game contains a lot of what I call the cinematic, platformer, deliberate choices that you have to make in order to progress properly. Sometimes in this game you have to run and jump with no clue of what's ahead, but you don't have a timer at that point. The traps, like I said before, are back in full swing. The classics are back with the spike, but not the slicers though. No, these have been relegated into horizontal slicers and crushing doors in some levels. We also have wall spikes now that can kill you if you touch them while you're going down or going up a wall. Other traps include little guns that fire when you step on a pressure plate, which is something that you have been taught to do in the first game because it opens doors. So this one is very smart. The falling platforms are still there, but this time there are platforms that will not shake before falling. They will immediately fall without any warning. Among other traps, we also have some magma, which is terribly terrible, and rotating platforms that will seed under your feet without a moment's notice. Just like in the original Prince of Persia, these rotating tiles can be found if you jump up and down. I wanted to call attention to the very labyrinthian design of the maps. The early maps are not that difficult. You can actually find your way without any difficulties. But as you progress in the game, it becomes more and more complicated to find your way through those maps without falling to your death, which, again, is another deadly thing. Falling works pretty much like the first one. The combat in Prince of Persia 2 is pretty much the same, except this time the prince will not draw his sword automatically. You have to do that. But the same blocking and attacking animations have been used, of course, bettered. They have been improved. So the flow of the animation is even more impressive, making the combat look even more realistic. In this game, you already face a plethora of enemies, sometimes 2 in one screen, sometimes 3, and sometimes even 6 enemies may attack you at the same time. In this game, the atmosphere is varied. You start off in Persia, colorful and bright under the sun. You then move on to a cove of pirates or thieves, where everything is dark and dreary. The caverns are all brown colored, and there is a tinge of magic in the air. You then move on to an abandoned city, where disaster struck in the past, and now the cursed souls roam about. Lastly, second to last, you visit a temple, a mysterious temple of the Shadow and the Flame. Finally, you face the vizier back in Persia, or actually in a realm made by the vizier. This all creates an atmosphere that is varied, interesting, and carries you through the entire story of the game very well. As before, the use of time is of the essence. Not from the beginning of the game, but after level 3 or 4, I don't remember exactly which one, a timer starts but gives you 75 minutes rather than 60. Another thing that is back is the shadow, but in this case, you control the shadow. You are the shadow. And this is another gripe I have with this game. The difficulty has been ramped up significantly from the first one. Whereas in the first Prince of Persia, increasing your life was optional to keep you up and fighting for longer, in Prince of Persia 2, The Shadow and the Flame, it is mandatory that you collect life extensions as much as possible. In order to use the shadow, to turn into the shadow, you must sacrifice some life. And if you don't have enough life points, then you can't do that, and you cannot beat the game. So, Prince of Persia 2 has everything that its predecessor had. Deliberate platforming, deadly traps, combat that is straightforward, time is of the essence, and the shadow is also present. Let's talk about Prince of Persia 3 now. I didn't actually play this game when it came out. I couldn't run it in my computer, so it was relegated to a long time later. Now, actually, just for this video. The release of Prince of Persia 3D was quiet. Not a lot of people heard about it, and I definitely remember not a lot of people playing that back then. I didn't even know that there was a Dreamcast version until recently, which surprised me quite a lot. So, with this in mind, I had to decide for this video, was I going to play the PC version or the Dreamcast version? There was one problem with the PC version. I got it running in widescreen, I got it running in 1080p, but the cutscenes were not collaborating. So I decided to use a Dreamcast emulator to play the Arabian Nights version. Now there are some distinctions between the two versions from what I know. The character animation is much faster, the prince moves faster in Arabian Nights. Combat is slightly different, and the controls are also varied. Not to mention that some items are not immediately used when you pick them up. Now, let's talk about the game itself. I did play it on the PC before I started playing it on the Dreamcast, so I can compare a little bit of both. As far as the platforming itself goes, we could say that it is still a cinematic platformer. The creator themselves compared it more to Tomb Raider with baggy pants, which I must agree with. As I played through the game, I could only imagine myself running around as Lara Croft. That is not to say that it's not a good game, it's just to say that it wasn't innovating as it did before. It was following the trend created by Tomb Raider with a 3D cinematic platformer that followed many of the tropes created by Tomb Raider. However, many elements of the first two games were kept. For example, the deadly traps, with spikes, slicers, falling tiles, and some other traps. Falls are still deadly, but it's a little bit difficult to gauge the correct distance that you can fall. One of the differences between the PC and the Dreamcast is the combat itself. While in the PC, every time you are locked into combat in a 2D view, and it's more of a fighter than a Prince of Persia fighting, you are locked in that view and you move around the character. You swing and you can feint swinging, and it is very rewarding. There is a fanfare once you beat the enemy, and it is very satisfying. On the Dreamcast, it was more streamlined. You encountered an enemy, you would draw your sword, the camera would pan to 3/4, so you could see yourself and your enemy in the screen. There was no combat music, and there was no fanfare once you beat them. There is a good return to individual combat one-on-one without a lot of people as in the second game. Every time you encounter an enemy, they are alone. Maybe there is someone throwing stuff at you, maybe shooting a bow, but you are always fighting one-on-one. The atmosphere in this game is a little bit odd. You start out in the dungeon much like the first game, for story reasons that I'm not going to get into right now. Then you climb through the castle where you're being kept, you run around, you escape, and to my surprise you end up in a balloon of all places. And then you fall into a temple, into the mountains. Yes, the atmosphere is not exactly like the previous ones. It is very mysterious and varied, for sure. But none of the places actually have a special touch as they did before, or will again in the future. Now, this game was considered to be terrible when it came out for a variety of reasons. The controls were not good, the graphics were not perfect. It was really complicated to play it on PCs because it required QuickTime, something that not everybody had installed in their PCs. And if you had the wrong version of this application, it wouldn't actually run. It was a mess. It was a mess. But in my opinion, what was really problematic was the absence of time. Nowhere to be seen. There was no time limit. Take your sweet time exploring the levels. Nothing is going to stop you. There is no time limit. That is, until the last level, causing a final fight that is a bit of a button masher in my opinion. I didn't actually enjoy fighting the last boss in this game. It was just a rush. Another element missing in this game is the shadow. It is nowhere to be found. The mysticism is somewhat lost in this game. So, for the checklist, Prince of Persia 3D or Arabian Night is still a cinematic platformer. There are deadly traps in the forms of spikes and slicers, and deadly falls. Combat is 1-to-1 again. The atmosphere is a bit off, but there's no time pressure, and the shadow is nowhere to be seen. So, maybe that's why it failed. Huh. Or not. And so, we conclude with the original trilogy of Prince of Persia. 1989, the first Prince of Persia came out and basically created the cinematic platformer style, the genre that is slow, methodical, and very well crafted. Beautiful animations are a must. The second game was better at some points and worse in others, but still a better game overall. And unfortunately, Prince of Persia 3D, or Prince of Persia Arabian Nights for the Dreamcast, was a letdown. It was still a cinematic platformer, but so many elements were missing. Let's take a look at what the future holds for us.
Am I to be stolen away again?
Most people think time is like a river that flows swift and sure in one direction. But I have seen the face of time, and I can tell you, they are wrong. Time is an ocean in a storm. You may wonder who I am and why I say this. Sit down, and I will tell you a tale like none that you have ever heard.
Prince of Persia 3D was released in 1999. Then, in 2003, Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time was finally released to an unsuspecting crowd. This game was very well received and is still adored by fans all over the world, and for good reason. Let's take a look at what makes the Prince of Persia: Sands of Time a new type of Prince of Persia. Following suit with the platforming style, it is not exactly cinematic, but it definitely took so many elements from it. The movement is more fluent, it's more flowing, but it is still deliberate. Although you have many more maneuvers in order to navigate, you still have to be careful and mindful of your environment in order to properly traverse all of the pitfalls. The traps are back, but they are not as lethal as they once were. At first, they may kill you in one go, but once you improve the prince's health, you may take 1 or 2 more hits before you fall. Falling is still as deadly as always, Certain heights will kill you if you are not careful, and they may catch you off guard sometimes. The parkour navigation was new to any game at the time. It was fresh, it was refreshing, and it was very welcomed by everyone. This type of movement would bring about the era of Assassin's Creed and many other games that are based on this type of movement. The navigation was essentially parkouring, but a little bit heavier than what we have today. As far as combat goes, it became something a little bit more streamlined. Apparently, the combat was not worth wasting time one-on-one. There was a higher volume of enemies in each combat, and it was easy in the first few moments of the game, and very hard by the end of it. The atmosphere of the Sands of Time is well placed. With beautiful graphics, the game unraveled your imagination and captured your attention with so many locations. Starting in India, you try to recover the Dagger of Time, and you move on to another castle or palace in order to retrieve that same dagger and fight the forces that have been unleashed by the Sands of Time. The grandiose palace is very well represented and everything is very well designed. In this Prince of Persia, time is the centerpiece of the story. It is, after all, the Sands of Time. You may rewind the time if you make mistakes in combat or navigation, making the game slightly easier from a certain standpoint, but it is not unlimited, meaning that repeated failures will result in your death. However, one missing element in this game is the shadow. At no point do you have a shadow or a shade present in the game, but that doesn't take away from the Sands of Time. As a matter of fact, people still love the Sands of Time with a passion that I have for the original game. So, Prince of Persia, the Sands of Time, the new game, the first game of a new trilogy, ticks off many of the boxes of the original. The platforming is still deliberate, the traps are somewhat lethal, the navigation is very well done, the animation itself very good. The combat is a little bit different in that you fight a lot of enemies at the same time, but the atmosphere is very well done as well. Time is of the essence. This is a Prince of Persia game. One year after the release of Sands of Time, the world was greeted by Prince of Persia, Warrior Within. And my man, what a game. I love this game. It was the first game that I actually played from the Sands trilogy, and I have to say I was struck immediately by it. Let's take a look, shall we? Now, we'll start with the obvious, the platforming. It is even more flowing than Sands of Time, but it is still deliberate. Pretty much the same mechanics have been used as in the Sands of Time, but the controls are smoother, more practical. It is not a lot better, but it is better, noticeably so. As with Sands of Time, the traps are not lethal. Falls are lethal, however, and they are a little bit more frequent if you're not paying attention at what you're doing. It is very important to highlight that the map in the Sands of Time and the map in the Warrior Within are a little bit different, in that Sands of Time is a linear game while Warrior Within has a hub, and you're going to be coming back to that several times, which may cause you to commit some mistakes and die for useless reasons. This game, unlike the Sands of Time, is way more combat focused, with weapons being a very important part of it. While the Sands of Time did have upgrades for your main sword, or rather the sword that you use along with the Dagger of Time, in Warrior Within you are relegated to using one main weapon and one side weapon. The side weapon can often be changed. You can throw the side weapon, you can steal the weapon from another enemy, or you may even smash some objects in the environment in order to get a new weapon. This combat-focused mechanics are not bad, they're actually quite good. The enemies all have a distinct way to be beat, although there are some combos that you will be using more than others. In Warrior Within, you find yourself in the island of time, but the atmosphere in this game is very dark. It is laden with so much beauty. The atmosphere in this game is quite different from the Sands of Time. In this case, you're trapped within the island of the Empress of Time, and you travel to a time where the palace was working 100%. Everything was in its place, and the present, where everything has decayed, falling apart. Nothing truly works the way it should. This highlights the difference in time, and the atmosphere is improved by that difference. Overall, the graphics are even more amazing than in Sands of Time. One thing that I don't really appreciate about The Warrior Within is the possibility of not getting what is called the real ending of the game, which did happen to me the first time I played through. You do have, much like in The Shadow and the Flame, to increase your life gauge to 100% in order to unlock a weapon that you can use to beat the real boss of the game and achieve the true ending. As with Sands of Time, time is a centerpiece here. There's no dagger of time, but time is of the essence. You travel in time, you still have the rewind powers, you can slow down time. It is very important. Now in this case, there is no shadow, but there is the Sand Wraith, a form of shadow in this case. One could say that it has replaced the old shadow, and I would agree with that. So, let's check that list again, shall we? A deliberate platforming, although not cinematic, is still present. Traps may be lethal, but not so much. There are still deadly falls. The combat is very much a centerpiece in this game. Time is central to the plot and central to the gameplay. And finally, the Wraith, or the Shadow, is back into the story. I would say that Warrior Within is very much a Prince of Persia game. Now let's take a look at the final game, or rather, the final in the timeline of the Sands of Time trilogy.
We all make mistakes. Some are small, some are large.
In 2005, Prince of Persia: The Two Thrones was finally released. It was well received as far as I'm aware. That's not the important point, so let's jump straight into it. First of all, let's talk about the platforming as it is. And in this case, it is way better than the previous two games. The Prince's movement is way more fluent, and there is the added Dark Prince movement set. So the already robust navigation has been increased. With the addition of the Dark Prince, there was also a timer linked to your life that you could recover by killing enemies or collecting sand points. But you had to rush in order to get things done or die trying. As with the previous two installments of the series, the Two Thrones did have traps that were not necessarily lethal and deadly falls that were lethal, deadly. The navigation was very much improved, including a new form of navigation through sliding up and down walls and hopping out of boards in order to reach farther places. Combat was changed slightly. Now, for the purposes of the story, the Dagger of Time has returned, and you do get new weapons. But the thing that is most interesting is the sneaking technique. As you navigate, you will find vantage points from which you can quickly dispatch your enemies, and if you are very skilled, you can dispatch all of them without being seen once, avoiding combat altogether. When unavoidable combat can be truly difficult and deadly, although it is not a one-on-one affair. As a matter of fact, that is the most problematic thing, the one-on-one affair of other games. As a matter of fact, if you ever find yourself fighting more than one enemy, you may find your death rather quickly. The atmosphere in this game is very good as well. The trilogy is soaked in good atmosphere. This time you are in Babylon itself, the home of the prince. And the scenarios are amazing. The maps are very good, the levels are very well designed, and navigation is again at the forefront. And as with previous installments of the Prince of Persia Sands of Time trilogy, time is a centerpiece to the story. And I could imagine that the Shadow is replaced by the Dark Prince. The Wraith from the previous game is now simply another form for the Prince. So let's take a look at what the Two Thrones has from the series. A deliberate platforming that may be more fluent than the others, but still deliberate. Traps that are not deadly in this case. Falls that are deadly. Combat that is involving. And time is of the essence, as well as the presence of the Shadow in the form of the Dark Prince. Yes, the Two Thrones seems to be a Prince of Persia game.
Time is like a river that flows swift and sure in one direction. But I have seen the face of time, and I can tell you, they are wrong. Time is an ocean in a storm. You may wonder who I really am, and why I say this. Come, and I will tell you a tale like none you have ever heard.
The wind is free, but the sand goes where it is blown, unaware of the world around it.
It was in 2008, 3 years after the release of The Two Thrones, that Prince of Persia got a new game, simply titled Prince of Persia. Meant to be a reboot of the series, this game was absolutely not well received by fans and critics. I played it back in the day, and I finished it back in the day, and I actually enjoyed it, but replaying it, I have a new opinion. It feels like a fevered dream. It's not a bad game, but it's so repetitive. It becomes nauseating after a while. But let's check if it ticks all the boxes of a Prince of Persia game. First of all, the platforming. Now, this game has a bit of a different type of platforming. It is not as deliberate as previous entries of the game. There is a lot of maneuvering and a lot of things that you can do to navigate around the maps. Well, actually the map, it's one single open map that is divided into sections. But still, you can seamlessly go from one place to the next with no loading screens. Traps are basically absent in this game. They are almost nowhere to be found, at least not as mechanical traps go. There are some kinds of blockages, so to speak, things that may stop you in your tracks. But here's the catch. Nothing is deadly in this game, at least not from a certain standpoint. The nice thing about the platforming is the variety of the maneuvers. Each button basically makes one different move. The game was originally designed to be on the Xbox, so the face buttons, which are colored, are presented all the time in colors, which may be confusing when playing on PC. Combat is back to an individual affair, but with more maneuvers. It is no longer a simple matter of attacking and defending, but now the enemies may change their stance, so to speak, and may become vulnerable to only one type of attack, which, by the way, you have 4 different types of attack. In this game, the prince has his trusty sword, which does not change at all. He has a gauntlet, he has acrobatic movements, and his partner in crime, Princess Alika, has magic. Magic is also an important part of the platforming. As you progress through the game, Alika will unlock new abilities to use with magical pads that will help you navigate around the maps. It is interesting, but I wouldn't say it helps with the cinematic approach. As I said before, the repetitiveness of this game is a little bit daunting, and nothing is truly deadly. If in previous games you would die instantly in the first trilogy, or you had a few chances to try again before failing completely, as in the Sands of Time trilogy, the Prince of Persia of 2008 simply takes you back to the nearest safe point where you were. Fall and Elika will save you. Get trapped by one of the, let's call them traps, Elika will save you. Even in combat, if you fail to defend yourself and the screen flashes red and you take another deadly hit, Elika will save you. So there is no failure state in this game, so to speak. The atmosphere in this game is very different from previous ones. The choice of cel-shaded graphics was bold, but incorrect in my opinion. The design of the prince is odd, but it's not that bad, and Princess Elika looks good too. Except for the flowing animations of her hair and the prince's, I think, coat? Yeah, it's a coat. They're not very good at all. But back to the atmosphere. The game looks very good. This time you are navigating through can be called or considered a city. A place in the world of the Prince of Persia that is not necessarily real. The story in this game is completely different from previous ones. Now, there is nothing regarding time. Many times characters say that time is of the essence, but there is no reason to rush in this game. You can take your sweet time. Although there is no shadow of the prince per se, one could say that the corrupted characters in the game that are the enemies may be considered shadows or wraiths or dark versions of themselves, but I'm not counting that as a shadow character. So let's quickly review. Platforming is not cinematic. There are no traps. The deadly falls are gone. Combat is back to being one-on-one, but it's way more complicated than needed. There is no mention of time as an essential thing, and the shadow, shade, wraith, or dark version is nowhere to be found. Prince of Persia 2008 was rightfully reviled by fans because it doesn't tick almost any of the boxes that made the original trilogy what it was, or even the Sands of Time trilogy. Prince of Persia 2008 is a far, long distance from what a Prince of Persia game should be. Let's talk about the Prince of Persia Forgotten Sands now. This game released in 2010, 2 years after the attempted reboot of the series. The Forgotten Sands is in a chapter that has been put between the Sands of Time and Warrior Within in the Sands of Time trilogy. Initially well received by the public, the critics didn't really appreciate it, calling it just a money grab due to the movie coming out the same year. Let's take a look if it ticks the boxes that make a Prince of Persia a Prince of Persia. First of all, let's take a look at the platforming, of course. It is by far the smoothest the Sands of Time trilogy has ever been. So good and so nice to navigate around the different areas in this small palace. As before, traps are present, but they are not deadly. Falls, however, are deadly. The combat has been completely changed. A far departure even from the Sands of Time itself, you now battle huge crowds of enemies at once, being able to kill many of them with one swing of a weapon if you have the correct weapon and the enemy is weak enough. The crowded rooms are quickly dispatched and the combat is a little bit more satisfying. In this case, the game decided to adopt an RPG approach with experience points in order to buy and unlock new skills for combat. As far as atmosphere is concerned, it is very much akin to the Sands of Time trilogy. This time you are in the palace of your own brother, and you must navigate through it in order to try and reach him, because the sands of not time have been unleashed, and cursing the entire region. Which takes me to the next point. Time is present, but it is not a centerpiece like in previous installments of Sands of Time. In this case, you get your powers from a djinn of water. A water djinn gives you the ability to turn back time. You can rewind time, and you can slow down time as well. It's a little bit confusing, but it is there. So, time is very much present in the Forgotten Sands. But again, there's no shadow, no wraith, no dark version. Only the prince. So let's tick everything again. The platforming is a little bit more cinematic than the previous entry, closer to the Sands of Time trilogy, which is good. Combat is not one-to-one, which is not necessarily good, but not necessarily bad for this game. Traps are present, falls are deadly. There is an important use of time, even though it is not part of the story itself, but the shadow is nowhere to be found. Forgotten Sands could be considered a good Prince of Persia game, even though it does not tick all the boxes. It tried something a little bit different in combat, and honestly I think that it's a good game, although a very short one. Now before I move on to talk about The Lost Crown, I want to say a few things. Overall, there are elements that are essential to the Prince of Persia games. First, you play as the prince, either becoming the prince as in the original game, or being the prince, as in the Sands of Time. I would like to imagine that the 2008 reboot would have followed something akin to the original game where you become the Prince of Persia. Another element present in every game is a deliberate platforming, a navigation that requires your full attention, not just mashing of the buttons. The 2008 version lets down in that aspect. Originally, traps were very deadly, but they are definitely present in all games, in one way or another. Combat, while differing from trilogy to trilogy and 2008, is still something quite present in the game. It is something that requires your attention. Even if you are fighting a mob, you have to stop and fight. And then, in my opinion, what makes the Prince of Persia series so special is time. In almost every game, time is a centerpiece. It is either rushing you to finish the game, or it is part of the story itself. But one thing that is true for every single Prince of Persia game is this. The prince has no name. He is called only as Prince. And there's nothing that can change that. Not even the terrible movie. And now the time has come to talk about The Lost Crown. The game releases 18 January 2024, 14 years after the last Prince of Persia game, the longest that the series has been dormant. I'm gonna be honest here. I haven't played it as of the making of this recording, but I have seen the preview gameplay, and by the time I got to recording this, the reviews of the critics and gaming outlets, they have been published, and they are mostly positive. And I don't doubt that The Lost Crown is going to be a very good game. What I do think is that it is not a Prince of Persia game. Now, from what I've seen in the gameplay preview, first of all, the platforming is absolutely against the cinematic roots of the entire series. A Metroidvania game, I like Metroidvania games. I love Metroidvania games. But a Prince of Persia cannot be a Metroidvania game. It goes against the entire concept of the original series, of the Sands of Time series, and to a certain degree, even the 2008 reboot. Navigation should be deliberate. Metroidvania games cannot have a deliberate navigation. They are rushed. They are meant to be rushed, and that's fine, but not for a Prince of Persia. From what I have seen, traps are, if not absent at all, not lethal. And the most egregious problem that I have seen is that there is absolutely no fall damage. Again, for a Metroidvania game, that is expected, but for a Prince of Persia game, that makes no sense. As far as combat goes, it looks like, as with any other Metroidvania game, the combat is relegated to minions that are in your way and you have to take them out. The bosses seem to be a much more spectacular affair, but that doesn't change the fact that fighting is brainless, even if you have a plethora of equipment at your disposal. Now, the atmosphere seems to be pretty much very nice. The graphics look amazing, and the background, the backdrop of the game seems to be very good. I can't wait to play around and see what the world is like. I can't really say what kind of atmosphere it's going to have, so that one I'm going to keep for myself until I have played and finished the game. Now, another thing that I don't know, and I have no idea of knowing until I play the game, is the presence or absence of time as a centerpiece or a pressure point. I can't wait to play the game, but I think that a time limit in a Metroidvania is not going to work. Therefore, unless time is a centerpiece, as in the Sands of Time trilogy, then I think that it has failed in presenting time as a part of the series. Another point that I haven't seen is a shadow, a wraith, or a dark form. But again, I have only seen the gameplay preview, and it does not include a lot of the game. Perhaps in a certain point you may find something akin to the shadow. So overall, the greatest problem I have with Lost Crown being titled a Prince of Persia game, you do not play as the Prince of Persia. You play as an immortal, Sargon. Now, I have no issue with that. The character can have his own name, he may be an immortal, but Prince of Persia games are ostensibly played with the prince. And the Prince of Persia in this game does have a name. The Prince of Persia now has been relegated to the role of Princess Zelda. He must be rescued, and Sargon the Immortal must do the rescuing. Now, I'm fine with the game being set in the Prince of Persia universe, but I don't like the idea that it is a mainline Prince of Persia game. Call it The Legend of Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown. Call it a Prince of Persia tale or whatever, but it is not a Prince of Persia game because the elements that make The Lost Crown are not the elements that make a Prince of Persia game. And now I would like to thank you for your patience, for listening to what I have to say. Again, I just want to reiterate that I haven't played The Lost Crown and I haven't seen the entire game. I do love me some Metroidvania games and I can't wait to play it. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have some opinions, you can leave them down in the comments and maybe I'll respond, maybe not. Thank you for your time, and I apologize for some of the mistakes I did there. I'm not a professional editor or anything, but I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you will consider my position. I am willing to consider that Lost Crown is a very good game, and maybe even down the line, I may accept that it is a Prince of Persia game, depending on what elements show up in the final version. Thank you, and have a nice day.